All right, guys. So today we're going to be looking into the manuals, a search for the best diagnostic manual for mental health. The study of mental health has advanced significantly over the past century, relying on comprehensive research to understand the brain. Two main diagnostic systems widely used are the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the ICD, International Classification of Diseases. Although both are prominent, challenges remain in accurate diagnosis due to differing criteria, leading to potential misdiagnosis of comorbid disorders. The DSM-IB-TR is a refined version used in the US, while the ICD, created by the WHO, provides a more detailed framework resulting in fewer misdiagnoses and better treatment outcomes for patients. So, what are the differences between the two? The ICD is organized by the World Health Organization, used primarily in Europe. The current version is the ICD 11. The DSM is organized by the American Psychological Association, used primarily in North America. They are currently on the DSM IBTR. The academic argument based on the research is the DSM is a great tool for research, but it does hinder patients with misdiagnoses or none at all. The ICD is a more lenient tool for patients and practitioners. Guidelines versus criteria up to the doctor's discretion and interpretation. That's something that makes this a really strong attribute. Both have become prominent attributes to the mental health community over the past 100 years, with intensive research and many revisions. Both systems of manuals have been around for over 100 years, if you don't count how many times the systems has been altered or modified by the names. So, the ICD. We are on the 11th version of the ICD, which came out in 2022. The first five were not actually called the ICD at all. They were actually created by Jacques Bertillon, who was the chief statistical and services analyst in Paris at the time. His framework is what really created the ICD for the World Health Organization when they gained access to it in the 50s and 40s, the late 50s and 40s. With that, the fifth version was finally called the International Classification of Causes of Sickness and Death, and it had over 200 titles, titles being another word for diseases or disorders. The sixth is the International Classification of Diseases, Injuries, and Cause of Death. The 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th are all going to be the World Health Organization. These are all going to be your ICDs. The 9th edition, however, is actually not called the ICD 9. It is the ICD 8 with revisions. When we go through these, you'll see that they keep count of all of the revisions they've ever done. Same with the DSM. The first DSM in 1952 to 1968 was actually done by the Medico Psychological Association, and it was started pre-World War II, excuse me. The Army had a lot to do with it, with the first five. A lot of people speculate this is due to early signs of shell shock or what would later be known as PTSD. The APA took over for the DSM 3, and from there we see the DSM 3, 4, 5, and then the 5 TR in 2000. The TR having a few revisions, not enough for them to garner a full new book. The research. Prominent universities in America include the University of Pennsylvania and Yale, along with a company called AiCure, who is ran by neuroscientists, created a project to see if AI using the DSM-IB-TR could make diagnoses faster and more accurate. They used bipolar disorder and major depressive disorder for evidence. The results included 10 psychiatrists around the U.S. concurred that even with AI technology, the research and criteria around both disorders from the DSM is not conclusive enough to diagnose the majority correctly. The doctors concluded that based on the DSM criteria, they were never 100% confident. Articles from a committee in the U.S. gathered to discuss the overwhelming use of misdiagnoses in the U.S. Members of every medical field, including psychology and psychology, were present. The results included a rough estimate of 80,000 to 160,000 deaths a year could be due to misdiagnoses. In 2013, Johns Hopkins estimated 251,454 deaths were due to medical errors. Diagnostic management teams, or DMTs, were implemented in every medical field to help support the doctor and patient with medical treatment and diagnoses. In Europe, the ICD network, we look at the first research article, Pia Teo, a psychobiologist from Amsterdam, conducted an in-depth comparison of the ICD-10 and the DSM-IV-TR. If you look at the table over here, you can see a direct comparison. When it says nodes, edges, and components, nodes are going to be symptoms. Edges are how clusters meet each other, like personality disorder clusters or hallucinogenic clusters, things of that nature. The results of Pia's in-depth comparison, the ICD network contains more symptoms, lower leveling of clusters, and a higher level of connectivity for patients. If you guys want to look at this chart a little longer, you're more than welcome to. Further research, a group of hospitals from France and Zurich University Hospital conducted a research on whether or not the DSM helped or hindered patients. They did this by reevaluating patients with bipolar disorder diagnosed via the ICD, but now are evaluated blindly by the DSM-IV-TR standards. Very few ICD diagnosed bipolar patients would have been diagnosed bipolar if they went by DSM criteria. Claims DSM is unreliable, unrealistic, and restrictive to patients. 20% of patients whose doctors use the DSM would not be diagnosed bipolar. Only 9.3 participants meet DSM criteria for diagnosis. The Cambridge Journal published an article comparing the ICD-10 and the DSM-IV-TR. Unlike Pia Teo's article, this compares the two manuals and how they're used in practice, focusing on validity and reliability for both the doctor and patient. The results include the DSM uses operational criteria, which means the rules must be starkly followed. The ICD uses guidelines and puts more emphasis on the doctor's understanding of the patient than generic conditions that must fit a patient perfectly for diagnosis. The ICD is all practitioners, whereas the DSM is strictly psychologists, psychiatrists only. The DSM has been productive in research, and the ICD has not generated the same amount of research around it. However, the DSM has handicapped credibility of diagnosis. The other options include the RDOC, which is a very new, from 2009, giant data library of research of medical nature. Created by the National Library of Medicine in America, the research domain criteria is a massive research engine for medical data. If implemented, it would be the one place for doctors to go to look for medical research, articles, doctrines, etc. It is the approach to get rid of operational criteria and data of the DSM, moving more to guidelines like the ICD utilizes. However, the RDOC is still in the experimental phase, and the future holds promising resources for mental health. In conclusion, the United States has paved the way for incredible research into mental health for diagnosis process, whereas Europe is focused more on helping the patient with problems at hand than giving out diagnoses. The ICD system surpasses the DSM due to operational criteria. This means the patient becomes more restricted to certain symptoms. Even by looking at the RDOC, which is still experimental, we know the process mental health still is. Using the ICD along with formal education on mental health is the best route for patients. But as students, it's up to you to decide, what do you